He's got an interstate running through his front yard. You know, he thinks that he's got it so good. And there's a woman in the kitchen cleaning up the evening slop. And he looks at her and says, hey, darling, I remember when you could stop a clock. Oh, but ain't that America? You and me, ain't that America? Something to say, baby, ain't that America? Oh, mother, pray, yeah. Little pink houses for you and me. Oh, for you and me. And vacation down in the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah. And there's winners and there's losers, but they ain't no big deal, 'cause the simple man, baby, pays for the thrills, the bills I'd kill. Oh, it ain't that America, you and me, it ain't that America. Something to say, baby.
Hello, my name is Christopher Knight, and I'm a writer. Who knew? I'd encourage you to write if you've ever felt like writing, because it's actually quite a roller coaster. So don't be discouraged. I do write better than I speak, I think, but you be the judge of that. It's been quite a year. Oh, actually, it's only been 7 months. I started this on 9/1/13. My phone tells me so because it's pegged there on Microsoft OneNote. Actually, I let OneNote write one of the sentences in the book, and if you can find it, I'll buy you lunch wherever you'd like to dine. The first person to find it. So that I don't know. That's a challenge. Hopefully somebody could figure it out. I'm sure there's an algorithm for that. I had a lot of fun with this book. It's a pretty crazy story, and well, I'm going to read it for free. Although we are going to sell it too. I will hopefully send it all to a publisher on it goes to pre-press, I think, on April 4th, and it's supposed to go into print on April 14th. So here's my sales pitch. Please buy my book. There's some great cover artwork, and we spent a lot of time on that. It was a lot of fun. I pulled a really cool team together in just the last few months. Actually, just the last month or so. It was a real rush project. I learned a lot about book publishing and editing, and it's a crazy world, and you can actually lose your manuscript in some dark void. So because of what I learned, I got a team together to build a little website called bookbicker.com. And if you can read or write, you should go to bookbicker.com. It's it's for readers and writers. Bicker means not only to have a petty argument, but to flow like a stream and to glitter, which is what you want your book to do. I do try to encourage other writers because it's a pretty cool process, and if you're led to write, you'll have a lot of fun. You ought to get out there and do it. Don't be discouraged. Although that's easy to happen too. Anyway, without further ado, and I hope you enjoyed the music. I was a rock star for a day. We had cameras and a big studio, and we really had a lot of fun right here in West Salem. There's a place called City View Recording, and a lot of thanks to Kevin McCarthy for his musicianship. He is world class, and his studio, which is as world class as well. So, and great thanks to John Fry and Jason Fry at Digital West Video. Great guys. We had a lot of fun. Thanks again. And all the rock stars out there, I found out about the easy button. Because I don't sound like I do on the video. Not in real life. Catch me at a karaoke sometime. All right. I am going to read my book to you, or at least the first chapter thereof, which is a lengthy chapter. It's about 10,000 words. The rest of the book, I started in September, and in about December, I figured out kind of how the story would go. And, there were a lot of other elements that came into play after that. But this really, it really started to roll forward, I guess, in January after the holidays and that, so after Christmas. Well, here we go. Inside jacket cover. These pages are sent as authorized by their creator, with all their faults and talents. All rights are reserved by their creator. There is no intention to malign anyone within these pages. Resemblances to actual persons living or dead, governments standing or fallen, or corporations, FOE, or domestic, are strictly coincidental. And while we were on the subject, I have great respect for the men and women of the NSA and the job they do defending our country, indeed the world, from threats various. It has to be a difficult position to be in, to be the defenders of liberty while impinging on liberties. We do live in contradictory times. Please remember that this writer is only a frail construct. His thoughts are his alone. He is blessed with all of the talents that his Creator intended, and filled with all of the faults that a corrupted world full of sin imbrues us each with. I hope by writing this book to open a dialogue. I know I am not alone. I know I don't always speak well. I write better, maybe. But as I write, I worry. I worry that some may take me wrong, might get scared, might hate, or worse, that I may confuse even one, though I try diligently to warn and educate. And I worry that my words may hurt others, which I do not mean to do. So if you are offended or scared, please talk to me. Please to remember that this work is not meant to define God. God defines himself through the Bible, which I do believe is the inerrant Word of God. Throughout this story, I have relied on biblical passages to prose a caricature of God's grace in a fictional context while trying with all my might to remain reverent. The purpose of this book, if it has an overarching purpose, is to relate God and his Son Jesus Christ to a world that may not have heard of him or thought of him in a while or never. It is written as entertainment as much as it is a fictional narrative with many twists and turns, some hidden gems and surprises. It is a dark fiction filled with lamentation. No author can write without embellishing a story with some of his own experiences. I cannot tell myself where truth ends and the fabric of the story picks up. That data can only be downloaded and understood by God. Lastly, I would encourage you, every one of you, to read the Word of God. Romans is a good place to start. God bless. Christopher Knight. I'm a bomb. Western civilization has degraded humanity past recognition. We approach the sterilization of the race with glee, awaiting the day when you can do so much more with less, perhaps never leaving our cozy crib, yet fully engaged in whatever task or endeavor we are assigned. The connection to our Creator having been broken so long ago, and our worldly overlords intent on usurping our worship with whatever shiny triviality that will capture our interest. We are so easily led. We clamor for more television, music, movies, more trash talk and debauched teens, more raunch and more blood. Every one of us titillated by the other's vile imaginings. A debased society destined to fall, and from so high it will be a great fall, a toppling in slow motion, with grand inevitability that compels the watchers who remain transfixed by their own demise. St. Louis, Missouri, Tuesday at dusk. She stumbles out of the bar, the coke still numbing her lips and waving her head's ideations with a blissful apathy devoid of attachment. The drinks were catching up to her now, too. Her vision crossed and her anger was only just at bay. There were so many things on her mind these days competing for her attention, and nothing seemed able to win the day anymore. The wind on her face was cool, the crowds inviting, engaging, and a welcome distraction. Why look for reason and distress yourself with so much frivolity at hand? Distractions are easier. It's dusk now, and there is a breeze in the air. She tries to fill her lungs with the coolness, a welcome change from the club air which oppressed her moments before, yet beckoned her back to its embrace. Her mind swam with competing thoughts that raced about. One moment she yearned for love's embrace, the next for her father's approval, and then her mother's comfort. And with each mental turn a sting as neurons fired in competing dissonance that would always struggle to be a symphony, the wish and the hope, sometimes a glimmer of harmony, of what could be, if only. She walked on, farther this time than last. Her mind swirling, the lights becoming fewer, further between, the road changing, sidewalks ending. Why the pieces never fit together was simply accepted. There was no fight left in her. There was at a time when she was younger, and before the drugs began in earnest. Her self-preservation sense was strong once, as was her drive to protect her sister. The early years had been the worst, when she learned how it was, what life in her small world was really like. There was no warning, no choosing, no escape. It all simply unfolded. She'd taken her sister's place as a sacrifice that one of them might survive, might reach for a higher rung and pull herself up and away. The escapes were always there too, of course, and they were needed with more frequency always, and more intensity. Pot was perfect for a while. It kept the pain at bay. Even when he was on top of her on those nights, she could close the door on it, change the mental channel, and languish. Revel even in her own quiet place and thoughts until he finished his business and moved on. If he didn't hit her. And that was always a big if. If he'd been drinking, and that was most nights, odds were good he'd take a swipe at her usually before, especially if she protested. Sometimes, though, no matter her complacency, he'd fly into a rage, usually after, and she had always thought it was a reflection on herself, something she lacked. Now she thought it was his self-loathing. The world is predictable. Man will always be at odds with himself and his neighbor, fearful that someone will conquer and take his spoils, or worse, plotting the plunder of others. Wars will be fought for reasons lofty and meaningless alike, with reluctance and malice alike, with abhorrence and glee, for profit and pleasure, because we believe and because we hate, and no one among us will be good enough to stop any of it, perhaps for a season. Amman, Jordan, Wednesday. She stepped on the trolley and into the crowd amid the sweltering heat and bodies sweating, her nausea wrapping fingers around her throat and midriff, the belts confining. She prayed. The city streets rolled by, wheels clattered, bells rang, horns shouted. No one looked at her. She'd never notice if they had. Her mind was intent, clear, with a determination that exhilarated because they don't want either of you to know how much they hate. Her father will be proud. He will pray, he will mourn, but he will never question his faith because of hers, her sacrifice. This was not only for her faith, her people, her nation, but on a personal level. She was engaged to, indeed in love with the thoughts that rode with her. She smiled, uncomfortable, wrapped up in the heat, the belts tightening. The world conveys messages of despair and hope, whimsically or by design, who can know? But there are those that use the human response to their advantage regardless. To the world we are all pawns, torn, raped, exalted, and put into tight-fitting dark boxes, slivers of light, shadow, no movement but our beating hands and hearts gasping, clenching, gnawing in a world of pain. St. Louis, Missouri, Tuesday, in darkness. She stumbles blindly in the dark, the sunlight gone. There is a grassy, jumbled knoll to her right, and her footsteps are uneven as she steps forward in the blackness. She likes her shoes. She could not believe that she'd found them again. They were exactly like the ones her dad had given her once. They came from Shoe Source at a discount, but she'd never say so. Not that she wasn't happy to save where she could, but there's no fashion trash, Whitey. Cash be king and ring-a-ding bling. Live it, love it, just give me more of it. Who was that, Lil Wayne or something? So it's all right. She stumbled near the shoulder line. It was so close. As a car roared by, her hair pulled in the breeze, and she shook, smiled, thinking, shaking deeper. The smile suddenly gone, though she'd never recognized it anyway. Another car approached from behind her, this one moving fast, headlights dimmed, closing the distance as she gauged the timing, stumbling on the uneven slope, breathing fast now, gulping the air, her heart and thoughts racing, tears welling as she in a rush spun her head and leaped into the oncoming passenger headlight. William Billy Fennell never even saw her. His mind was elsewhere, had been for days, having just lost his job the week before. He'd come into the office greeted by a silence uncharacteristic of a Friday morning. The bustle of 30-some insurance salespeople should have been well underway by the time he'd arrived, late again, 8:43, with really no excuse again, other than he'd perhaps had one too many oxys. He wasn't sure, couldn't remember really, but at 50, and competing with a much younger and more ambitious crowd, there were lots of things that his mind no longer had room or patience for. Substance abuse was just a means to cope, not the culprit, of course. He knew what he was doing. Well, his bosses didn't think so. No, they didn't think so at all. But the hypocrisy. Virtually every one of them had similar experiences. Most of his peers after 14 years had made their way either out and on to better things or up the ladder and were managing groups like the one he was in. He just wasn't management material, apparently. There'd been a couple occasions back in '03 and '06 when he could have moved up, but things had gotten in the way back then, and now another 7 years had passed since he'd even been considered for advancement. But he'd hung on. He'd almost left in '07, but had heard rumblings that jobs were getting harder to come by, and by '08 realized a job was better than a job line and simply stayed put. But that'd been the straw for him, and it was then that alcohol began to have much more appeal than the rest of life. Fortunately, no one was around for the run off the road in the snow of Christmas Eve '09, not even his wife having left him 2 days prior. That was a bad crash, and he'd been lucky to walk from it. He'd had the car towed out the following day. Still no one witnessed it. And then he'd gone to his doctor early Monday with back pain so severe he could hardly walk. OxyContin was the pain management tool of choice, he'd been told. And boy, did it work nicely. 4 years and 6 doctors later, the spiral had really taken a toll on him. There was a loud pop and a snapping sound a split second apart, followed by bumping, and his passenger mirror was gone. He slowed, pulling to the shoulder at the bottom of the hill, not sure what had just happened. He stepped out of the car, and the air was crisp, the wind gentle. A few leaves fluttered down as he began walking around the front of the car. He stared at the broken headlight lens on the passenger side. It looked like someone had thrown a rock through it. He moved up the side of the car, looking now at the passenger mirror hanging from its cable control, the case cracked, the glass gone. And in the dim streetlight he could see mud or tar on it. And on the window, actually on the door now, too, and all down the side in a streak. He wiped at it with his hand. Not mud. His heart skipped, and he swallowed hard. There was blood all down the side of the car in a long streak. He turned to get back in the car. Fuck. Oh, fuck. Damn it. He was heaving now, short breaths and his heart pounding, and he wanted to be anywhere but here. He stopped himself, and his thoughts raced and overwhelmed his senses. What if they're still alive? What if they're dead? What if they'll be okay? But what if they're dead? You can just kill yourself then. Just drive home, pull into the garage, and leave the car running. You've got to go see if they need help. He grabbed at the door handle, slipped, grabbed again, and the door opened, courtesy light now on. He thought briefly of fleeing. He leaned on the door and then bumped his forehead against the door frame hard, 3 times, before he pushed the door shut and began running back up the hill. His legs were rubbery, his gait awkward, and he weaved as he made his way back to the street light pole. He could see a lump on the roadside, a heap, like a pile of leaves, a rock, a trash sack. Dogs are man's best friend, though not all would agree. Some religions actually think dogs and pigs are filthy. Most agree about pigs. Guitars are lovely, and those that play them should probably be world leaders. Actually, it should be a prerequisite to power. If you cannot make music, you should not be a world leader. Jimmy Martin. Palladium Theater, St. Louis, Missouri. Smack dab. Sold out. He strummed a chord out of tune, but bent the A and hoped for the best. The crowd went wild and shoved forward, pressing against the stage as a diver leaped past him into the wild abandon. Lights aglow and flashing, the methodical rhythmic clash of musicality and lighting shimmering past him and into the abyss of the worshippers, who followed every essence of passion evoked from his instrument. His vocals only followed the force of his rhythmic creation as it flowed out, every nuance affected by the past within his mind's ramblings. The shadows created by hopes, dreams, secret desires, and failings too numerous. Those moments when he allowed his mind to create the rhythms from those thoughts as they came unbidden and unadulterated, created a force that could only be captured in that moment, once and for all, alive and unrepentant, though he might inside regret many of his actions, responses, and even desires. It was a dilemma he had yet to reconcile. But as the crowd cheered, he would play on and allow his emotions to flow out like a bursting dam, night after night, until he was spent. He did it not for the money nor the fame, though once those were indeed motivators. There was no conscious recognition of the changes wrought in him over the years, but the turning points remained, opaquely etched in a oft-addled psyche. His was tormented by many selfish choices, not the least of which has been his career path, more the result of a dropout mentality, a heavy addiction to cocaine, and free-spirit living. At 43, he was at the pinnacle of his success, though he could not yet know this. The wave of luck and sentiment he had ridden all these years was about to break. Tonight he kept thinking of his first love. While his guitar lay motionless under his hands and gaze, a spotlight catching his fretwork, his fingers dancing, eyes fluttered, his breathing quickened with the unbidden thought of her, standing by the jukebox in the frosty freeze back in Detroit, Michigan. Hers was a hurt but determined look, fearful but present and ready, even begging for escape. Her prison was the home her mother had made, the bed she'd made for herself and the 3 young she'd borne into the world like her mother before her. The history would repeat itself with the drugs, the drinking, the violence, the abuse. She saw in him an ability to navigate the perils of life. She saw a young man ready to take on the world, to lift her up, to save her from the pain. Our lives are chaotic and short. About the time we figure out our abilities, and perhaps even our destiny, there is something lurking around the corner to obliterate us, perhaps slowly, but often with intense and sudden force. Amon Jordan, Wednesday. Years before, her father had told her she was destined for greatness. When she was little, she believed it. It was vague yet guiding, like a pinhole of light that gave bearing to the path. His words comforted her. He was a good father, bespectacled, bearded, tall, a quiet countenance that soothed her. It was her father she'd always run to when trouble arose. He'd held her up while the world around her would not. He mentored a faith that she innately yearned for, drew strength from, and hope from, and over the years made hers. Some things take time to grow. Time, patience, and nurturing. St. Louis, Missouri, the accident scene. Her body was splayed beneath and behind the light pole. Her head tilted up, legs spread, feet socked and shoeless. The blouse she was wearing whipped up to just under her breasts, and blood splattered from her face down her front in rivulets and spray across her clothing and her bare belly. She appeared lifeless. A gash crossed her forehead at her hairline, and then suddenly she was gasping like a fish out of water, her head jerking, chest heaving, back arching. She kicked and rolled and then inhaled violently. She'd been clinically dead for almost 2 minutes, but no one would ever know this nor believe her when she told them. Her consciousness would never be what she had known before. Billy knew he'd hit her, knew it when he saw the sack shape behind the pole, the light casting an eerie silhouette of her nose and left breast in profile as he came up the hill, and rounding the light pole, he saw with horror the lifeless body before him. She was beautiful but broken, and perhaps dead. The conviction of his guilt mounting, crushing him with a brutal force that was all-consuming. Her body was almost 15 feet from the road, her feet pointing away, and he knelt down feeling her throat for a heartbeat. Nothing. He pressed again and with his other hand grabbed her wrist to feel for a pulse. Nothing. And then her back arched and her mouth made quick, furtive movements like a fish. Billy leaned forward, anxious, watching her, looking quickly over her for any hemorrhaging or obviously broken bones, and suddenly her eyes opened, terrified, and she was pushing herself up. No, wait, stay still. You've been in an accident, hold... She would not hold still. She became more agitated and wild-eyed, like a cornered animal, frightened and with unfinished business to attend to. Please, hold still. His hands were on her shoulders now, trying to calm her. His voice steady. Please, you're okay. Just rest a moment. Look at me. She resisted at first, and then slowly she looked up, like she was testing her head and neck, the back of her head against the light pole, stopping her head movement at about a level gaze and then rolling her eyes up to meet his. Her head lolled to the right. He looked closely at her confused stare, her breath still coming in short gasps, eyes crossing and blinking the blood away as it streamed from her forehead. She was helpless, only dimly aware. He felt again for the pulse on her wrist, present now, rapid, beats missing and thready, but there. She tried suddenly again to sit up, and he held again her shoulders, afraid her neck might be broken. Hey, stop, please, hold still. You've been in an accident, you're hurt, okay? She stopped and again looked at him. Why? She asked, her voice trailing off. He didn't know what to say to that. But he knew she could be seriously injured and he'd have to get help here. An ambulance, 911. Look, please hold still. You're hurt. I need to call an ambulance. It was actually the last thing he wanted to do. It was certainly not what he needed legally, but it was the right thing, and he'd do the right thing. No! She was wild-eyed again, lurching up. Damn it, stop, please. Look, you've got to hold still, please. You're hurt. Wait! She stopped and shrunk back a little, her body rocking with her quick breaths. Just stay still, please. You could hurt yourself bad, your back or neck. You might... just don't move, okay? Please, if you'll... Stop it! She was suddenly in tears and shaking. Don't! Don't what? What do you mean? What should I do? Just leave! I can't leave you. You're hurt. You need help, okay? Let's kind of wait here a while, okay? She seemed okay with that suggestion, relaxing a little. He thought, and then, if it's okay with you, I'm going to look you over for bleeding or broken bones, okay? She just stared at him, but her gaze relaxed somewhat, and he sensed she was resigned to his attention, though she still appeared confused and preoccupied, lost in her thoughts. She looked down at her body, taking in the blood splatter that covered her, confused and enthralled by it. Billy quickly took his phone out and punched the flashlight app. She took no notice. He scanned her body closely on each side and the ground around her for pooling blood, protruding bones, any obvious injuries, all the while his mind racing and reminding him that internal injuries could be fatal to her, and she really needed medical attention. He dialed 911 and was putting the phone to his ear when her hand flew up, snapping the phone from him, and her other hand quickly stabbing at the keypad. Stop, stop, stop. The call never went through. No! No ambulance! Leave me alone! She was scrambling to her feet now, and he was lurching back and up to catch her, steady her, keep her from falling or running. He didn't know what to do. This was crazy. What do you want to do? He asked, and then reflected that this was like asking a cat. There was no cogent response expected. She weaved on her feet now, and he quickly closed the gap between them and balanced her at her shoulders while her legs quivered, and she cried, sobbing. Her head fell against his chest, the blood letting loose afresh from her forehead onto him. But he relaxed and held her. Then after several minutes, and as the sobs abated, Look, maybe you're not too hurt on the outside, but you could be hurt inside. I really think we should take you to a hospital, okay? No. She was spent, her adrenaline waning. Please, no. I'll be okay. He thought hard now. He really did want to avoid trouble, but foremost he wanted to know She was not going to be dead in the morning from something he'd caused. He couldn't live with that. He might be a lot of things, but he'd never willfully injure someone and look away, no matter the cost to himself. Look, please, let's just get you to a hospital and... She was adamant again. No! Her eyes wide and she pushed back, almost tripping, her feet losing grip on the muddy grass. Okay. Then please, just sit down, okay, before you fall down. He thought, and then, just wait here, okay? He eased her down to the ground, and she relaxed again. He bent down and pulled her blouse down to cover her, keep her warm, the night chill suddenly on them both as she shivered, and her teeth chattered a bit. Wait here, and I'll be right back with the car, okay? She nodded, not looking up. Amman, Jordan, Wednesday. Somewhere in the world there is always hope, there is always remorse, and there is always pain. These responses drive us each in different ways and to diverse ends. Actively and passively, we each change the world in our way, for better or worse. We are each designed with a purpose, though we may not understand it. It will seek its way to the surface and reveal itself, with or without our intent. She had made her way downtown today to a warehouse packed with machinery and cars, most in disrepair. The ceiling was high, at least 30 feet, and there were racks of pallets, barrels, carpets, fabric bolts, most dusty and disorganized. It felt neglected here, with odd items in strange places. Rows of electronics, old communications equipment, copiers, each in pieces with their hard drives missing. Similarly, old computers. Wire, chemicals, and more nondescript barrels. A couple of forklifts occupied the center, and she stood there in the midst with at least 150 feet to any outer wall. She heard a door to her left open and close. Then footsteps, one person, moving steadily toward her. Her heart started pounding. She closed her eyes and turned her back to the approaching footfalls. They were steady, booted, heavy with a slight shuffling clip on the heel of one step. Purposeful and close now, and then silence briefly. "Are you Aisha Takatka?" A calm male voice asked from maybe 15 feet behind her. Her lips quivered, and she couldn't catch her breath, her heart pounding in her head, her hands trembling at her side. She clenched her hands, breathed in and managed, "I am..." Tears were in her eyes, still closed. "Turn to me," he said, and she obeyed without hesitation. "Look at me," he said, and she opened her eyes. "You are ready," he said, and with that her heart's pace halved, and her chest filled with breath, nostrils flaring, and her head rising. A sense of elation filled her. "You will stay here tonight with me. We will wait. Are you uncomfortable with the belts around you?" "Somewhat. If I may remove it?" "You may. Then we will move upstairs." Then, "My name is Zaid." Aisha Takatka was 23, a university student from a modest home in Amman, Jordan. Her father, mother, and 2 younger brothers knew nothing of her whereabouts this day. They could know nothing until it was over. Her recruitment and training began months before with a simple introduction to a charmingly charismatic professor after a world history lecture. He had been eager to share so much of his knowledge of history and politics, mixed with his own interpretations of Islam, and with such insights Aisha had never heard expressed before. His voice and delivery were composed with such an engaging fluidity and grace, each word he uttered nuanced to draw the listener to the next. It was mesmerizing just to be in his presence, to listen to his persuasions, to be caught up in the moment, his moments, his ministering, his prophesying. And all too soon Aisha was no longer the child she had presented herself as to the university campus only a few months before. She was transfixed by him, and transformed at some point, she couldn't really identify when, but along the path of their meetings, a part of her died to itself and was reborn, made, remade, with all the convictions of her mentor, her chief, her commander. Palladium Theater, St. Louis, Missouri, after the show. Do we ever really listen to the still, quiet voice when it warns and pleads? Mostly we will disregard it until in hindsight we will admit there is something that we only wish we would allow to better guide us. Our will prevails to our own detriment, and our foolish hearts are darkened. He made his way from the stage down and around the corner into the stadium tunnel and back to his space. His space, not the band space, but his space, where he could be alone, if only for a while. Tonight had been difficult, mentally, emotionally. Thoughts of her, nigh on a quarter-century had passed between those summer nights, that year of blissfulness which at the time seemed like all he would ever hope for, all he'd ever need, embracing her, caressing her body, loving her. He had lived for it. But with her pregnancy came sudden changes in her, and the spell was broken. Realities awoke in them both that split them apart, tore away the facade of harmony, and replaced it with uncertainty and restlessness. He was gone before her 8th month. And with his departure, she resigned herself to the cycle of desperation and despair she had always known. There would be no getting out, no escaping the inevitability of her plight, and she would raise her young in those same environs as her mother before her had done. But tonight he was troubled by his daughter, the very daughter he'd skipped out on all those years ago. He'd not understood it all at the time. Not at 20. No, at 20 and with all your life ahead of you, being a parent is not well understood, let alone a part of your planning. Not that he had then nor ever been much for planning anything really. Things just happened. Sometimes they might seem orchestrated, if only because he's had such a knack for dancing to the music of life, twisting his emotions to each turn. But at 43 it was becoming a far different life, demanding a judgment, an accounting, a summation of self-worth measured by the outcomes of those around him. It was a strange turn, new to him, not of his own muse but cast upon him, an amalgam of events real and imagined. He poured himself a drink and sat down. Where was she? What had set her off? She had found him at age 12 at a concert in Indianapolis. Her mother never did explain how she'd managed the trip from Detroit, Michigan alone. At the time he figured she'd run away for the weekend. The truth had been much darker. He preferred to look on the bright side of things, assuming all was fun and games. At least, that was true back then. Her mother had named her Lilibet, and Lily for short, though he'd always called her Lil when they were getting along, or Lee if he was angry with her. Sometimes he'd tease her about the Bet part of her name, calling her Bet-E, Lil-E-Bet, or Little Bet. Lilibet meant God's promise, and her mother used to tell her she believed she was at the time, but she'd sure as fuck take it back if she had the opportunity. Today she'd been with him most of the afternoon, just hanging out on the bus, smoking a few bowls. That was okay with him. He didn't know about the cocaine she'd been doing for some time now. If he had known, he might have made some changes. But some things are learned too late. She had a knack for keeping her secrets. They'd been on a roller coaster since last summer. She joined her father again last year in May, as she had most years as a teenager, for his company and the perks that went with hanging out with your rock star father. This year was the first in 4. He'd not seen her since she turned 18. For his part, having his daughter along for the tour was a source of pride, a dad doing the right thing, mentoring to the best of his abilities, which were grand and promising, if only he could learn to direct the orchestral potential of his fatherhood. But now he realized that at 23 her life lessons were not learned from him any longer. The die was cast. There would be no parenting, though he would wish for it. No steering the rudder, and these realities were dawning on him as he watched her sink of late, her countenance sullen, her vitality withdrawn. St. Louis, Missouri, the accident scene. Billy Fennell trotted back down the hill to his car, his adrenaline pushing him, and quick rushes of hope and wonder filling him. He was smiling. She was going to be all right. She's going to be all right. It's all right. He was praying in his head as he trotted down the hill, and sometimes on the exhale, "Thank you, Jesus. Keep her safe, Jesus. Thank you, God." He got into the car, spun around, and at the top of the hill turned around again, heading back to the light pole where he'd left her. She wasn't there. He pulled up close to the pole, as much off the road as possible. He got out and called for her. Hey, hello? You there?" Silence. He reached into the car and flipped his high beams on, and her back came into view. She was standing some ways to the right in the high brush that met the tree line, head down. He moved quickly, though awkwardly, across the grass slope, approaching her and trying to remain calm. "Hey, how you doing?" He was beside and within a few feet of her now, the car's light playing off her and his shadow. He wasn't sure, but she appeared to be looking for something. "You okay?" He waited, but she just scanned the brush, and then she said, "My shoes." She was standing in socks in the mud and the brush. He really wanted to get her into the car, get away from here and out of the sight of any passers-by. Well, we can get you some shoes, okay? If you had shoes, I don't see them now." She turned to him, her face troubled and swollen. Already she did not look like the girl on the ground just 10 minutes ago. He was alarmed and at the same time moved by her. "Those were my shoes I wore for my dad. I got 'em to—" and she weaved around as if she were about to pass out. Billy jumped toward her to steady her again, and holding her arm with his other arm around her shoulders, he moved her slowly back down toward the car. Halfway down she trembled and collapsed, the cold shock and pain all working against her, and she just folded, slipping down the knoll. Billy caught her in his arms, almost lost his balance himself, but managed to lift her back up, and slipping his arms under her back and legs, he carried her the rest of the way back to the car. With difficulty he managed to open the passenger door, flip it away with his foot while balancing her, and then, kneeling down, he tucked her into the seat. Suddenly there were headlights on the hilltop. A car moving slowly came by. A passenger glanced at his car, but it moved on down the hill, never stopping. Billy counted his blessings and quietly thanked God. They drove not far around a few bends and country lanes just outside the city limit, and pulled up a drive to Billy's house, a small 50s ranch with a daylight basement, nicely appointed with a tile roof and detached garage. The grounds were kempt, Billy being fairly obsessive about order in his surroundings, even if he could not keep it all together in his life. Indeed, the attention to detail inside and out of his home was, if he'd ever reflected on it, and probably he had, a picture of what he wished his life had been like everything with everything, at least most things, in their place, belonging, having purpose. He himself had missed feeling that way for a long time. Feelings of worth and claiming a place in life had eluded him, especially in relationships. 2 wives and as many live-in girlfriends had not been the blessings he'd sought. Trouble had followed, most often within months. The newness wore thin quickly, and without a place for everything, well, it seemed Billy was the first thing to get displaced, and he'd withdraw, finding contentment wherever and in whatever he could. They'd traveled in silence, and only now she turned her attention to him, slightly turning her head and raising her eyes to meet his. He could tell it pained her to move her neck, and he hoped against hope that she would heal, and inside he prayed again. "Where are we?" she asked. "We're at my home. You're welcome to stay here." And seeing concern on her face, a slight, he'd call it healthy distrust, he added, "You'll be safe. I promise. It's okay." She sighed and sank back a bit. "Can you carry me in, please?" she said. and he was relieved that she was comfortable enough to acquiesce so easily. "Sure, just a minute. Let me open the doors and make a spot for you. Be right back." And he leaped to action. He left the engine running to keep the heat on for her, and he left the headlights on to light the way to the front door. Once inside, he cleared the living room couch of pillows and cushions, 2 of which he moved to one end to support her head. Then he returned to the car and gently guided her out into his arms. He carried her from the car up the path and through the doorway into his living room, and there he knelt, fell really to the floor beside the couch, all while cradling her wincing body. He felt for her, knew her pains must be great. He would do his best to protect her now. Once he'd made her comfortable, he returned to the car and pulled into the garage. He'd have to clean and repair it tomorrow, or as soon as he could get the parts. But certainly clean it, wash the blood away. He'd go nowhere with it like this. He went back into the house and poured water for them both. She watched him, moving from the living room to the kitchen and back. She took the glass from his hand and drank slowly, touching the rim gently to her lips, because it hurt and because the coolness felt good against the swelling. Her whole face was swelling now, especially her cheeks and eyes. Blood was caked everywhere on her face, too. Billy turned on a lamp, and seeing the extent of blood and swelling, he winced. "Oh, child, that's gotta hurt. I'm so sorry. I didn't see you. I swear, I'm so sorry. Let me get some things, okay, to clean you up and some ice to help with the swelling." "It hurts," she managed. "I've got some pills for that, too, okay? Just a second." And he sprang into action, happy to be needed. It felt good to be of help. He headed to the bathroom, retrieving a couple OxyContins and a washcloth, which he wet, then realizing he'd need a bowl of water to the kitchen for that, and an ice pack from the freezer. He knelt beside her and handed her back her water glass. "Here, take these. They'll help with the pain, and help you to sleep." She took them both and drank from her glass. He then held the ice pack gently to one cheek. "Does that help?" he asked. She looked startled, but then relaxed as he held the pack to her face, and she nodded. He propped the pack with a pillow, and then he wrung the cloth out and began gently dabbing her face to remove the blood. He didn't know where to begin. Fortunately, the bleeding had stopped. He could see that she should have stitches, though her scars would be plenty. For the next hour, he sponge-bathed clean her face and upper body and dressed her wounds, taking care to clean without reopening her cuts, stopping when she winced, and often holding her hand for a few minutes when she appeared to be in pain. Soon, though, the oxys worked their magic, and she dozed mostly, much of her pain having vanished. It occurred to him suddenly that he still did not know her name. He looked her over again for a purse or pack, and there on her belt loop was clipped a small coin purse. He tugged it open. Inside, $40 and change, a debit card, and a Michigan State ID. Lilibet Martin. Palladium Theater, St. Louis, Missouri, after the show. Lilibet had been abused since birth in one way or another. Neglected by babysitters on the best days, abused by whoever was in possession of her on her worst. The ghetto was no place to be a child. Her father didn't understand this, having not lived his life in her world. Oh, he'd spent time enough there, but he'd been journeying the Midwest, touring small dive bars with his guitar and a friend. It had never struck him how harmful her world could be, at least not until she began to share her stories. But again, some things are learned too late to make a difference, to make the choices one would have made had they all the facts. Facts are a troublesome thing. Do we ever really know just the facts, ma'am? There being so many points of view and all. What is truth? Where does it exist? Lilibet sometimes could follow the threads of her life and conclude logically that her existence could be altered, could with the right formula, the right patterns, the right music, could be a wonderful thing, full of brightness and hope. But her heart being so broken so many times, since even before her birth, even in the relative safety of her mother's womb, she'd felt the hurts of rejections, from her parents both, from Mom's new boyfriend, from those who'd coyly wonder why Mom couldn't just have an abortion. Why did she need to have this child? She was, after all, already a single mother. Wasn't one enough? From her father, who just couldn't be bothered or couldn't sort out the mess that was a bad relationship choice. He'd never really had much in common with her mother. There was this let's have as much fun as possible in whatever time remains mentality. It just didn't matter what was on the menu. If it was new and promised a rush, they were on like Donkey Kong. He'd always been this way, pretty much since his birth, and Lilibet's mother needed so much repair. It was the perfect formula for a bomb. Lilibet was just the fuse. They'd not been together a year, and Lilibet's ears were just beginning to form when her mother would scream at her father that he wasn't looking for work hard enough, that there had to be a job out there, some job that he could do, even though nobody should expect too much of him, fucking idiot, and that he should at least be paying the rent. It hurt him that she didn't understand he was doing his best. Maybe he just really wasn't capable of any more, even though he could conceptualize it. Or maybe his self-will was just capable of blinding his senses. Or was it external? Was something acting on him? He'd wrestled with all of these thoughts at times. But drugs and youth have a way of clouding your decision-making, and time can be a cruel master. Some things, again, are learned too late. Some of these things Jimmy Martin was thinking tonight because he could not know them all. Could never have all the truth, just like any one of us. We only have our point of view, perhaps that of our mates if we've chosen wisely. But even so armed, truth eludes us the world, all of mankind, pretty much in darkness, leering out. Leering, what a foul descriptor, he thought. Not leering, but rather contemplating, considering, in fact wondering, just how things will unfold given all the current facts, and yet we are flying blind. The mother had so many needs for which he didn't understand how to provide. Had he been 20 years older and filled with life experience, perhaps he would have understood intuitively just what to do to overcome the obstacles they each faced. Her upbringing had left scars, from abuse, neglect, and since the time she was 11, alcoholism and drug abuse. He had not the tools to even understand the ramifications of all these pieces, even if he had known all the truth at the time. The pregnancy just brought it all to rush in a light. All to light in a rush. Still, he could not, these days, forgive himself for having walked out on her, for not fighting for her, his child. His mind defended him by reminding him that he was doing his best. After all, didn't we all deserve a gold star for trying? Later he'd learn that no, he didn't. There was no success in trying. You have to try until you make it. But tell that to the broken hearts. They say learn from your mistakes, but oftentimes by the time you learn it, everything has changed, and it is too late. Because he could connect on a visceral level with an emotional frequency that resonated with his audience, his records sold, and his concerts sold out. And these days, that connection had been almost religious. This year, in fact, there had never been a time so filled with perfect sessions. From his arena venues to some of the more intimate settings he'd played in, this year had been magical, like no other. This would be the one for the history books. He would be a rock and roll Hall of Famer. Jimmy finished his drink and lit a joint. He wrangled with the day's events in his mind. He ran over in thought again the morning with her. What had she said this morning? Where were you, Dad? Where were you when I needed you? Why weren't you there, huh? Why didn't you save me? She'd yelled it all. What? Are you serious? Lily, I was young, just a kid. I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. He was taken aback by her words, the suddenness of her vehemence. She just stared back at him. Lil, I'm really sorry. They'd had this conversation, or a version of it, at times past. But today she was so animated, distressed. It really struck him that she was struggling with something very deep within her. "Lil, I love you, baby girl. You gotta know you mean the world to me, kiddo. I can't fix the past. I can't. There's nothing I can say or do for it. But I'd do anything for you today." Her fists were clenched, her heart pounding. She was angry and hurting, and he couldn't comprehend her plight, could not understand that she saw him, perhaps had always seen him, not as a father, but as her friend, her confidant, even wished he would be hers. Amman, Jordan, Wednesday. Aisha spun her abaya from her shoulders and unbuttoned her blouse, revealing a tight-fitting leather vest belted around her breasts and midriff. She with some struggle against the belts began removing the vest, her fingers grappling with the leather. There were several pouches presently fitted with sand-filled canvas packets. The weight had been a strain on her at first, weeks ago, when she first donned the vest. She'd had trouble moving about naturally, the weight often tipping her balance. Her father, on more than one occasion, had quizzed her. "Aisha, are you feeling poorly? Aisha, do you need my help? Aisha, what causes you to stumble?" Aisha's responses were always conciliatory, and at first nervous, but she gained confidence in her ability to not only handle herself physically, she became practiced at the art of deception as well. In fact, her training progressed quite rapidly once she had committed herself to the cause. The more she thought about repression, war, inequality, social justice, the disparities of outcomes when contrasting her people with those in the Western world, Europe, Israel, America. There was only one solution of which she would be a part. After all, there was little else for her here, and all would soon be in the next world anyway. She would do her part. Zaid closed the space between them, staring at her skin, her breasts, her sides, her back, all while gently turning her, a hand on her shoulders. Her skin was chafed and indented by the vest. "You are putting ointment on yourself, Aisha?" She nodded. "These spots here," he touched her sides near her breasts. "They are deep. The skin will bleed. I have something to apply. You should not be so injured." He picked up her abaya and draped it around her. Then picking up her vest and blouse, he motioned for her to follow him, and they made their way westward to a stairwell and up to a small windowless but well-appointed apartment. The floors were cypress wood, the kitchen cabinets olive wood, and all the countertops were a brilliant stone polished like agates. The faucets were all a silver alloy used for its cleanliness. There was a room ionizer blowing a gentle breeze throughout the space, and the smells were sweet yet subtle. Zaid led Aisha through a passage to a large bathing area, replete with a sitting tub and bidet, while a tile mosaic filled the floor and walls of a walk-in shower, fitted with several water jets and steam emitters. She was honored to be here. This was her time to prepare her body, to cleanse and make herself fit, clear of mind, fulfilled. Zaid pointed out soaps, manicure utensils, toiletries and oils, fresh linens and towels. Everything was prepared especially for her. Her favorite scents and patterns were all here. She suddenly felt very warm inside. Her body tingled, and she smiled, nodding to Zaid, who stepped back into the hall and disappeared from her view. Now she dropped the abaya from her shoulders and slipped her dress from her waist. She pushed her fingers down her navel, reveling briefly in her own touch, her fingers beneath the waistband of her undergarment, and slid them down to her thighs, where they fell to the floor. Aisha stepped into the shower, where she would remain for the next hour, warm water cascading across her body from differing angles, steam enveloping the room, leaving her with the feeling she was almost floating amongst the clouds. She quivered and smiled. Zaid was certainly enamored of her beauty. No doubt in a different place and time he would woo her, would take any chance to entreat for her hand. She was honorable and demure, a prize. But alas, this was not to be. She was not for anyone. That was made clear to him. She was programmed and primed, ready for her martyrdom, and he would guide her the last few steps of the way, would make her ready, and help her prepare. There would be a time tomorrow at a gravesite where she will lie between the graves with a hood over her head. Then they will return here to video her commitments, for the record and for her parents. They would be told as soon as it was accomplished. He simply sat and waited tonight, knowing she would need time and space to decompress herself. They had 2 days from tonight before her family would be concerned about her, she having told them a ruse about a trip her class would be taking to study archaeological ruins, and so he settled himself for the night. St. Louis, Missouri, Billy's house. Billy finished wiping away the blood from her torso and toweled her dry. He brought a pair of his pajamas out for her and put them on her as gently as he possibly could. He covered her with the blanket, and then with her still shivering despite the radiant heater he'd propped near her feet, he placed a thick down comforter over her, tucking it in all around her neck and body, letting the heater push warm air up under the coverings. Lilibet sighed in her sleep, content for the moment. Her face, though, now was swelled half again its size. Bruises formed all around her cheeks and eyes, lips swollen, nose split askew and probably broken. The gash at her forehead split and oozing again. Billy applied some antiseptic cream and gently placed sterile gauze across the wound. He stared at her for a long time while holding his hand to the top of her head. Then closing his eyes, he prayed for her and for himself, for healing and for thanks, and for guidance. He did not know what to expect next. This was no ordinary day. At 1 a.m., he went to his room and changed his clothing, which was splotched with Lilibet's blood and mud and grass. He finally made his way to the recliner in the corner of the living room. He kept dressed in case he had to respond suddenly if she awoke. He draped himself in a simple knitted afghan and was asleep in minutes. Lilibet was more than asleep. Somewhere, she could not identify the voice nor direction, her name was being called out, like she was being paged in a hotel lobby. Her eyes darted and rolled beneath the lids that fluttered open, revealing white. She was floating in a dark space, dropping, falling faster, not sure what was coming up to meet her, but she sensed it could not be good. There was an unwholesomeness about whatever it was to be. It made her nauseous and fearful. Her hands were stretched out, fingers tensed, and she mentally leaped against the darkness. Her body jerked, and in her mind's eye the falling suddenly stopped, like an elevator arriving on a floor, and the doors opened but all around and horizontally, slowly, revealing a red glowing horizon, all too near, and darkness above and below that reverberated with the echoes of a voice rising and falling in tenor, speaking things she did not quite understand. You won't want to listen, but you must, and know this, that the time has come, is past indeed. Who can know it? Her body shook. The voice continued in its sing-song. There is no reason. There is no salvation. There is only darkness. We are all. And then it was a child's voice trying to recite a poem. Blind, each turning in the wind, hopelessly unhinged, and no God will go before us. No God will turn toward us, that we fight within ourselves for our God, heaven, hell. And then the voice turned menacing. Who are you, child? Lilibet convulsed. Her pulse quickened, eyes darting, and Billy stirred, but neither of them awoke. Why did you come to me? I didn't. Lilibet spoke out loud and in her mind's eye. Billy stirred more at this. But you did. You reached out into the darkness, little one. You reached out very far. The voice spoke determinedly, with authority, convincing her even though she fought against it in her thoughts. A murky cloud wafted over her, and her vision flickered, faltered for a moment, filling half her mind's eye with a confusion like the black and white static between the channels on an old analog television set, and many of her memories were altered, shifted, colored by whatever malevolent force spoke to her. She could feel it prodding the back of her mind like a long, sinewy, and very slender finger, piercing the top of her skull, pulling her hair with it into her brain, touching parts of her inside, behind her eyes, the touch contorting her vision. Again the flashes of static, and now white, bright white. Lilibet's eyes were wide, wide open, and terror filled them. No sound came from her rictus, though inside her mind she screamed out dementedly, in fury and horror. The patterns of thought evoked in her now were terrifying and were her reality. She knew in that instant, with great choking clarity, that she had slipped several cogs into a vastly divergent existence, in which thoughts would come in unbidden multiplexes of incomprehensibility, through voices that would shatter her sanity. Billy was over her. The lamp over her head was on, and he was holding it over her, illuminating her face and body, his mouth agape, stunned at the force of anguish she exhibited, the spasms of her body contorting, eyes wide with dread, and then a guttural "ah," long and winding, expelling all of her breath from her wide-open mouth with her lips pulled back, exposing her teeth. Her cuts were split open again. Blood and lymph ran down her face into her eyes and mouth. "No, no, no, please," he sobbed, frantic, frightened, and unbelieving, hoping this was a very bad dream from which he would suddenly awake, knowing it was not, that she was hurt, and hurt bad inside somewhere. That is the end of chapter 1, and I hope you'll join us in another night or two. Check back, and we'll continue our reading. Until then,